So good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm the event director at Literati Bookstore. We're pleased to welcome Thomas Frank in support of The People Know, and tonight he'll be in conversation with U of M lecturer Phil Christman. As a reminder, some overview of our webinars. We can't hear you or see you, and the chat is closed as well, but we do recommend you keep the chat window open. That way I can drop links to purchase Thomas and Phil's books from Literati Bookstore. And also, if you're watching later on YouTube, there will be links to purchase in the description below. And while you can't use the chat, you can use the Q&A to submit questions at any time. So whenever a question pops in your brain and you'd like to ask it, feel free to use the Q&A feature that's on your toolbar, either above or below, and type it out and submit it. And at the conclusion of the conversation, I will read a selection of those questions. As a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com. Thousands of titles are available for curbside pickup if you live in Southeast Michigan or the Ann Arbor area. And in lieu of a book purchase, we'd also ask that you consider a $5 donation to sustain our virtual programming. So whether you'd like to think of that as this week's or this month's or this year's subscription to our programming, you can make donations at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for your attendance this evening or this morning or this afternoon, depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us. So without further ado, I'll introduce our author and our moderator this evening. Thomas Frank is the author of Listen Liberal, Pity the Billionaire, The Wrecking Crew, and What's the Matter with Kansas. A former columnist for the Wall Street Journal and Harper's, Frank is the founding editor of The Baffler and writes regularly for The Guardian. He lives outside Washington, D.C. And a former substitute teacher, shelter worker, and home health aide, Phil Christman currently lectures in the English department at the University of Michigan. His work has appeared in the Hedgehog Review, Commonweal, Christian Century, The Outline, and other places. He holds an MFA from the University of South Carolina, Columbia. He's the editor of the Michigan Review of Prisoner Creative Writing, a journal sponsored by the University of Michigan's Prison Creative Arts Project. And he lives in Ann Arbor, Michigan. They can't hear your applause, but I hope that you will clap at home and join me in welcoming Thomas and Phil into your living room. Take it away.
Ooh, where'd he go?
Yeah. So I'm going to give the people a brief peroration about your new book, The People Know, which is the occasion of your visit. This book slaps. This is a very good book. I read it in April. I found it incredibly helpful in understanding the populist political tradition. I wish that I'd had it around when I was writing my own book, Midwest Futures. I think the best way that I can explain the effect of this book is that it's one of those books that if you read it, you'll have a permanent headache from grinding your teeth whenever you hear anybody talk about the concept of populism. Whenever you hear a phrase like right-wing populism, or when you hear people say things like, you know, Bernie Sanders says things in a way that's really clear and easy to understand. So does Donald Trump. So really, they're just the same. It's all populism. Your head will just explode with rage if you read this book by Thomas Frank, because you will go from knowing in a general way that that's wrong to knowing precisely why and how completely that's wrong. I think that's a very admirable thing to accomplish. So I thoroughly recommend this book.
Geez, Phil, I don't want anybody's head to explode. I want the knowledge to radiate forth. Let's put it that way. I tried really hard when I was writing this to make it to do what you said. That's how the book started. Was my own personal annoyance at hearing the way the word populist was just is abused. I mean, by everyone. By the way, we're doing our Zoom webinar right here, but if you go over to the Zoom webinar being hosted by, whatever academic department or nonprofit foundation, they're doing exactly what I just described. They're talking about how populism is, this form of, they don't even bother to define it because they all know what it means. It means a kind of, racist authoritarianism, or demagogue, kind of racist demagoguery or something like that.
Mhm.
They don't even have to define it because they all know that's what it is. The problem is when they all know something about our own past in America, everybody knows it and nobody bothers to investigate it. And when you do go and look at it, it turns out to be not only wrong, but completely 180 degrees away from the correct, the truth of the matter. Then you've got a interesting story on your hands. And that's the story I tried to tell here.
Yeah, I mean, I guess kind of my first question is I mean, you've alluded to the way that this book was born in a general annoyance, but yeah, what was the precipitating incident? What caused you to decide that you wanted to write a book, kind of both reclaiming the word populism and also tracing? It's important not to lose that part of it. Tracing the history of anti-populism as a kind of
good question. So it's easy. It was when my annoyance peaked after the election of Donald Trump, and there was this sort of a national sort of paroxysm. By the way, just so people out there know, we're talking shortly before. We're in late October 2020 here, so the election of 2020 has not happened yet, and we don't know if this paroxysm is going to be repeated. But after the 2016 election, this paroxysm of kind of liberal outrage that swept across the world that I inhabit, and it involved people describing Donald Trump as a populist, part of a populist tradition that is anti-intellectual, that's bigoted, that's paranoid, that's pathological in all sorts of ways. And I'm from Kansas. I know a great deal about what populism actually was and where the word comes from. And every time I heard this, it would just drive me crazy. And so that's when I started doing the research, and I figured I had done a lot of research about populism when I was in graduate school, I should say, way back when in the 1980s. But I lost interest in it and went on, did other things. And I sort of dusted off that got the books out of the attic again, dusted them off and dug back into it. But here's what really got me is, as I was doing this research, the beat down of populism. So, and we'll tell the story of populism here in a minute, but how populism began and then how it ended. And how it ended is really a shocking story of how the sort of elite powers of this country, the upper class of this country, really circled the wagons and came together and destroyed populism in this kind of what would you call it, like a hailstorm of invective. And they described it as democracy out of control. They started to use the word populism as a synonym for mob rule, for what happens when you let the lower orders of society just run wild. And that's what we see again happening today. And so I started noticing that American society, this paroxysm of rage at Trump voters, who are always defined as being the lower orders, the white working class, the deplorables, this kind of thing. This paroxysm of rage at these people is a phenomenon that is repeated throughout our history. It happens again and again and again. It happened in the 1890s. It happened again in the 1930s, and it's happening again today. And these instances are so similar one to another that they, that I had to come up with a name for them. And so I called it democracy scare, that what we're seeing right now is a kind of democracy scare. This is what happens when you let, when everybody participates in a democracy. And of course, it's totally invalid from the very get-go, because Donald Trump lost the popular vote. He only became president because of the Electoral College, which is one of these instruments that was devised at the beginning of the country to make sure that
his judges are very openly trying to consider how they can invalidate the popular vote as much as possible.
That's right. Republicans have been doing that for a long time, and his judges are, and it's the most extreme case. This is actually kind of the most amusing case. We'll come to this in a second, but the populists, the original populist party in the 1890s, probably their biggest issue was the gold standard. They wanted to take America off the gold standard. Well, Donald Trump just got put a woman on the board of the Federal Reserve here in Washington who wants to put America back on the gold standard, which really makes me chuckle. It's so preposterous.
Yeah, one of the things that one of my notes to myself as I was reading the book was this book explains the whole gold standard versus free silver thing, and crucify mankind upon a cross of gold, etc., so much more clearly than my high school textbooks did. And that is kind of, I think for most people, if you ask them about the capital P populists, the actual people who called themselves that's kind of the thing they think of. So what was the significance of that, and what's the significance of that debate that people have lost?
It is funny and we have totally lost track of it. And my daughter was just going through that sort of unit in high school a few years ago, and I remember trying to explain it to her because it's actually a very exciting chapter of American life. But the way it is remembered nowadays, it's almost impossible for someone to get into it, for someone to even understand what they were talking about. But in fact, it's really simple. So the country was on a gold standard. What that meant is that the dollars in circulation were directly related to how much gold the government had in, its vault in Manhattan or Fort Knox or wherever it was that they kept it at the time. And that meant that, for one thing, you couldn't really do deficit spending. The government could only spend what it meant. Austerity was what we call austerity today was just the natural policy. You couldn't do anything other than that. In terms of federal policy and in terms of how the economy ran for ordinary people, it was really, 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 it was a terrible way to run an economy because the amount of gold in the world is very small and it doesn't increase by very much every year. But the population at the time in the United States was growing by leaps and bounds. And what that means is that the economy was also growing. I mean, this is the golden age of capitalism in America. The railroads are expanding, where the steel mills, et cetera, all this is going on. And the amount of money in circulation cannot change by law. What that means is it's called deflation. This is the value of the money in circulation goes up and up and up. And it's the opposite of inflation. And if you're someone who borrows money, it's really, really bad. And farmers, because you have to pay back what you borrowed at an amount, let's say you borrow the equivalent of 5 bushels of wheat, and then you have to pay it back in a couple of years. And now it's the equivalent of 10 bushels of wheat. And that's what it meant for farmers. It meant that they were in debt perpetually. Farmers borrow just as a matter of course. That's how they plan their year. That's how they go about doing what they do. And they're constantly getting ripped off. And this is not ripped off, driven into the ground. And so they could see their way of life being destroyed. I mean, they still had to work and they had to produce and all this sort of thing, but they couldn't make a living at it. It was incredibly difficult. And so that was the significance of it. And they said something that's really obvious to us today, which is if you use a different metal that we have a lot of, like silver, you can get out of this problem. Second, if you just forget about metal altogether and just have the currency be this kind of invented thing that the government, says this is how much money's in circulation, you can also avoid and that's what we do today. Mm-hmm. And so that's what and here's the funny thing. This group of farmers, that's what the populists were, was a farmer, a farmer labor party, but predominantly farmers. That's what they wanted to do. And these were largely uneducated people, but they could see that the system that we have today is superior to the system that they had in the 1890s. And they went up against the assembled geniuses and orthodox economists and, corporation attorneys and CEOs of their day. Every single one of them thought they were crazy, thought they were cranks for suggesting that we get off the gold standard. But the punchline is the populists were right to want to get off the gold standard, and the highly educated people of their day were completely wrong. It's one of the great, real great lessons, I think, in hubris and the need for humility, I think, in our entire history.
Yeah, I mean, they were basically working out practically a better approach to money that became the dominant that became a banal part of economics as it's now practiced.
Yep.
Yeah, one of the things that you get at in the book is the ways in which populism was it was an intellectual movement. It wasn't intolerant of learning. It was just intolerant of elitism. Right?
Yes. And
Yeah.
isn't that okay? So, and I know we're skipping ahead here a little because people are like, well, what is populism? Don't you want
Yeah.
to tell us what it is first? And I probably should, but that's exactly the point that I try to make in the book. And that not just that we're getting the word wrong and we're getting the movement itself wrong, but that populism holds a valuable lesson for us today, that when we blow it off like the way we do, that we completely close our eyes to this, to a lesson that actually could be really valuable, that could really help us understand the world that we're in. But I probably should say something about the movement itself.
Yes, please. Yeah, it was kind of my next question was going to be what are the tenets of populism, and then what are the tenets of this anti-populism that you also.
All right. Well, let's do that. It's so populism was a farmer labor movement, mainly emphasis on farmers. It grew up in the 1880s and 1890s, and it came out of a group of it was like a farmers union. It was called the Farmers Alliance. And they, farmers were, as I mentioned before, farmers were on their way down in American life. They were more than half of the population. It was the largest occupational group by far in America. And they were all family farmers. There was basically no such thing as corporate farming at the time. And they were in deep trouble, and their predicament was getting worse and worse and worse as the years went by. And so this group started organizing them and saying, if we come together and read up on the matter and listen to lecturers and try it, we can figure out why our situation is so bad, and we can start to do something about it. And they came up with all sorts of different solutions to work in the marketplace and try to better their position, but nothing worked. And they finally decided to go into politics. This was the term that they used at the time. Let's go into politics. And they launched a third party. And this is the last great third party movement in American history. This Farmers Alliance that I'm describing was an enormous mass movement. And so they were able to make a big splash almost immediately when they went into politics. But it still came as quite a surprise. They set up this third party. Their first sort of brush with fame came in my home state of Kansas in the year 1890, in the November of 1890, when these people came out of nowhere. No one had seen them organizing, or nobody knew what they were doing, but they took over the state legislature, beat the dominant Republican Party. Kansas then, as today, was a one-party Republican state. And started on their career of disrupting American politics. They understood themselves as a kind of labor party. This is at the same time as the Labor Party was coming up in England and in Australia, and the Social Democrats in Germany. And the populists were very similar. They understood themselves as a coming together of all the different sort of workers groups in America. So they had a lot of labor unions were part of it. The Knights of Labor, which was a big union at the time, the United Mine Workers, things like this. And also all of your different reform elements of that time. So votes for women was one of their issues, this sort of thing. And they brought all of these different issues together, all of these different reform traditions. And they had, their way of putting it is they had three main issues. One was the gold standard, which we talked about, getting America off the gold standard. The second was nationalizing the railroads, because the railroads were this monopoly that a farmer would face every single day. When you live in a small town in Kansas or something like that, there's only one railroad that services your community. And if they quote you a price for something, you don't have any alternative. That is the price. And they also wanted government farm programs, which eventually, and all three of these things eventually came to pass. We didn't really nationalize the railroads, but we did regulate them. And then the populists also wanted a whole range of electoral reforms to make democracy more transparent and more direct. And this is very interesting because they understood that they were in a period of extreme concentration of wealth, extreme inequality, and they talked about this constantly. This is the heyday of the Vanderbilts and the Astors and the Carnegies and this kind of thing. Extreme concentration of wealth, extreme monopoly power. The laws were then as now, the laws were on the books, the anti-monopoly laws, but they weren't enforced. And so Rockefeller is pulling together Standard Oil at this time. You have U.S. Steel is coming together, I think, shortly after this, but Carnegie Steel anyways. And monopolies everywhere you look in American economic life. And at the same time, extreme political corruption, because it's really, these things go hand in hand. Extreme concentration of wealth and extreme political corruption. And ironically, it's not ironic at all, the exact same things are happening today. It's the exact same situation that we're in. That's one of the reasons why populism is so relevant. Anyhow, they had a brief, but colorful life as a party. They lasted for about 6 years. They had various adventures, elected governors and mayors and members of the Senate and the House of Representatives all over the Midwest and all over the South. Not just the Midwest, all over the West. They were big in California and Idaho and places like that. All over the place, you had populism. It's the last time that a third-party movement was able to contest elections up and down the ballot all over the country. And achieve a fair degree of success. Anyhow, they the story of how they ended is absolutely fascinating. Should I tell it, Phil? What do you think?
Hit us.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
so the economy goes into this terrible depression while all this is happening, and it looks like the Populist Party is. Oh, I forgot to tell you. So they made up the word. The word itself is part of their legacy. They made up this word in 1891. They were some guys on a train in Kansas, traveling from Kansas City to Topeka.
You said they coined it in consultation with a local Democrat who knew some.
Yeah,
Latin.
we know the guy's name. This is all known. There were newspaper stories about it. Not at the time. The newspaper stories came out years later, but we know who the participants in the conversation were, and then it was their formal name was the People's Party, but they knew right away that wasn't going to fly, and they had to come up with something catchier. And they were on this train ride, and a bunch of these local politicians were, sort of huddled together, and one of them knew Latin, and they said, well, the word for the people in Latin is populus, and so they just, made the obvious leap to populist, and the word caught on almost immediately. They knew they had their hands on something awesome, and they started using it immediately. And it became both their party's word, the name for the party, but also a kind of curse word in the 1890s. We'll get to that in a minute. But yeah, that was actually one of the fun parts of the research was, this word is used in the craziest ways. Let's look up where it actually came from. And to my great surprise, Phil, while I was doing my research, I discovered that the Kansas State Historical Society. So a lot of the records of populism, when you go to do research on it, they're in like state archives in the Midwestern states. And the Kansas State Historical Society has an enormous amount of material on populism, magazine articles and people's scrapbooks from the time and this kind of thing. But one of the things that they had was a file, I was just on the phone with them saying, do you know where this word came from or anything like that? And they're like, well, we got the file folder about it. And I'm like, well, can I see that? And they're like, sure. And there were all of these stories. One of the participants in this conversation was a journalist for the Kansas City Star, and he lived up into the 1930s. And I guess he basically dined out on this story his entire life. It was like like every 5 years or so, on a slow news day, the Star would rerun his story of how this word was coined. These guys riding on a train, and this is how one of America's famous political movements was born. Anyhow, it's kind of an amusing story, but yeah, the word caught on. The party is growing by leaps and bounds. The economy is in a depression, and it looks like populism is the coming force in American politics. And then it's 1896 comes. It's presidential election year. The Republicans nominate William McKinley, kind of a cipher. Doesn't really do much, doesn't say a lot. He runs what's called a front porch campaign, a lot like Joe Biden doing the basement campaign. And he doesn't leave his house. He just sits there on the porch, and people come and talk to him. Delegations come and meet with him. And the Democrats meet for their convention, and they do something crazy. They first say, we're not renominating the sitting president of the United States, Grover Cleveland. He's a very conservative Democrat. He's extremely unpopular because of the Depression. Then they say, we're against the gold standard. They make this declaration. They're turning against the gold standard. And then they nominate for president as their champion this 36-year-old man, William Jennings Bryan, a one-term congressman from Nebraska, who wins the nomination on the strength of this incredible speech that he's just given, which you mentioned before, the famous Cross of Gold speech. He's just bowled over the convention with his oratorical skill, his skills, and they nominate him for the presidency. And the sort of Eastern establishment of America, just its jaw drops, and they cannot believe that this is happening, that one of the two major parties has done this. And then a few weeks later, the populists meet for their convention, and they say, well, this guy Bryan just stole our main issue. By this time, obviously the gold standard has become the big, issue that everybody is fighting about. And the populists were like, well, up until that moment that they nominated Bryan, the populists thought they had it in the bag because they were the only ones with a good position on this issue. But the Democrats stole it. So what are they going to do? Well, a lot of the populists know Bryan personally because he's from Nebraska. He talks like a populist. He's not with them on all the issues, but he's with them on this one big issue. And so they say, what the hell? We'll nominate him also. And so they got behind William Jennings Bryan, and they knew at the time it was like this was a gamble. If he won, they'd have some power in Washington. If he lost, this was pretty much the end of them as a political party. After you make a compromise like that, it's hard to come back. But they did it, and Bryan goes out on his campaign, and as I mentioned, the sort of establishment of America went absolutely berserk when this happened. And they attacked William Jennings Bryan with everything they had. And by the way, when I say establishment, I mean all of them. It's not like today where the establishment is split in two and you have billionaire Republicans versus billionaire Democrats, which we'll talk about later, which is very interesting. Back then, they were all on one side, the Republican side. And and when I say all of them, I mean tycoons, millionaires, railroad owners, all of the great society figures of the day, along with the great academics of the time, all the great thinkers, university presidents, sociologists, economists, historians, the society preachers, who were an important factor back then, were all on the side, all taking the Republican side. And most importantly, the press. The press was overwhelmingly against Bryan, and against him in the most strident and vicious way. Mm-hmm. And I've assembled a whole lot of the material. I think I'm the first one to do this, to actually go back and look at what the press said about William Jennings Bryan in 1896. Now, the populist newspapers at the time and populist writers commented on this because they were so, they could see what was happening to them, and they could see that they were being destroyed. But it hasn't really been analyzed much since 1896. But the attack on Bryan was incredible. And it took one basic form, which was, well, they said this is the class war, that the country had wandered into the class war. Bryan represented this uprising of the lower orders, but they would say lower orders, but they like to say it is society's worst elements pitted against society's best elements. And by best, they meant themselves, the high-ranking, people at the top of the hierarchy. And by worst elements, they meant those people in Kansas, the deplorables. And they saw it as a class war, and they would often depict Bryan as a kind of Robespierre. It was, it's the French Revolution all over again. It's this terrifying moment. It is funny because you think about how Bryan met his end. famously, he became a fundamentalist, well, he was already very, very religious, but then he became the great champion of fundamentalism in the 1920s.
And it's so telling that his public reputation has been reduced to the Scopes monkey trial.
Yeah. We completely forget what he was, what he represented in 1896. He was a brave man and a talented man. And, I don't want to sugarcoat him. He was a Democrat. Democrats had a lot of problems. This was also the party of the South, of the Jim Crow South. And Bryan, generally speaking, didn't say anything about that. He just kept his mouth shut. He didn't criticize those guys,
which one of the things that really moved me about this book is realizing to what an extent populism before that moment was, I had been taught to see it as kind of like white people pulling together for white people issues. But to some extent, you point to ways in which the populists were trying to sort of bring Black and white farm workers together in a way that, like, it's like, this is what we admire Fred Hampton for doing in 1970. There's a quote that blew my mind from this representative, William Neville of Nebraska, who was a representative, where he's attacking our empire building in the Philippines, and he explicitly connects the denial of human rights abroad to the denial of the vote to Black people. I mean, he's just saying this Angela Davis shit in 1900.
Yeah, I think it's 1890. I think is it 1900 or is it before that? Is it 1898? Well, no, it can't be, because that's when the war was.
Yeah.
So it was a little after that. Yeah, he was the last populist, by the way, the last populist in Congress. But yeah, they in their early days. So populism was, as I mentioned, was strong in the Midwest, the Great Plains, and also in the South. And in the South, they did something really quite astonishing. Well, you should take a step back. The Farmers Alliance that populism grew out of had a Black faction. They were called, history refers to them as the Black Populists. And it was a segregated organization, but they had an organization for African Americans. And it was not just, it was quite large. It was a significant organization. And they were whenever they had their conventions, these guys were there. And so when they launched their third party, they did something quite radical in the South. Now, before I say this, I should point out these guys were not like anti-racists by modern day standards. They were not advanced thinkers in this regard. But the South at the time was a one-party Democratic region. The Democrats that ruled the South were extremely conservative. History refers to them as the Bourbon Democrats. And the Bourbon Democrats kept their power. At the time, they hadn't disenfranchised anybody yet. That was yet to come. So people could still vote. You would have, large turnout in the South like everywhere else. And the way the Bourbon Democrats stayed on top was through this doctrine of what was called white solidarity. And the idea was that they would go to these white farmers and they'd say, who are very, very poor. Mind you, these are extremely poor. Like, these are some of the poorest people in America. I mean, and today it's still, in some places still the case. And they would say to these people, your interests as white people outweighs any other interest you might have, any other grievance that you might have. And so you have to stick together and you have to line up for the party of white people, which is the Democratic Party. And this actually worked for decades and decades and decades. And the one time when it broke down and sort of failed to work was this brief moment at the beginning of populism, when the populists said, and this was their strategy, they said this openly, that they said, your white farmers, your interests are actually closer to those of the Black farmers. You guys have a lot in common and your economic interests are basically the same. So you need to vote for us. And they said this to both the poor whites and the poor Blacks. And they actually had some success with this. And there a number of people have written about this, but the one person that I wish I had quoted in the book that I couldn't find the article. I didn't find it till after the book was done, was W.B. Du Bois wrote about this brief moment in Georgia when the populist movement came along and tried to bring together the poor whites with the poor blacks. Well, this really frightened some people. This kind of is the class war, that's almost explicitly what it is. And the masters of the South, in response to populism, unleashed the most incredible campaign of race hatred and race fear that you've ever seen. It's just absolutely extraordinary. And it took them a while, but they were able to suppress populism. And once they did, they disenfranchised black voters. This is in some states. In other states, it took longer. But in some states, immediately after populism was down, they disenfranchised black voters and disenfranchised a whole lot of poor whites along the way. And in other states, it took a while longer, but the thinking was the same. Sooner or later, this is going to happen again. Sooner or later, you're going to get some group that comes in here and says, your interest, you actually have more. And they wanted to make sure that never took place again. So before the civil rights movement in the 60s, there were historians that would say, this is the one bright spot between the end of Reconstruction and today. It was the only. So if you're writing in the 1930s, it's the only bright spot in like race relations since the Civil War. But it was very, very brief. And anyhow, that's what happened to them. And it is kind of a shame and kind of a travesty that today we use the name of that group as shorthand for racist demagogue. That I looked that one up too. Like, what did you call a racist demagogue back then? Well, what they called him? A demagogue. That was the term. A Southern demagogue. A populist was something different. A populist was like, someone who promoted the ideas that I just described. A racist demagogue was, like a George Wallace type, there was like a great number of them, but they were not populists. They were something different.
No, because they represented the interests of an elite ultimately.
Yeah, and it's yes, exactly, and they were playing a game that was very familiar to observers of the South, and everybody knew how it worked. But populism was something different. Was this thing that once threatened to disrupt that game. Anyhow, that's how populism ended. Was between the Bourbon Democrats in the South and the McKinley Republicans in the North. That was the end of it, and they crushed this movement. And it fell apart of its own. After the compromise on Bryan, it fell apart also. But the next chapter in the story is a more hopeful and happy one, and that's the 1930s. When Franklin Roosevelt is president, organized labor, another mass movement of working class people, is on the rise. There is a lot of farmer protest in the 1930s also. And you also have this incredible cultural climate. It's like the decade of the common man. This is where I get my title, by the way. Carl Sandburg,
Yeah.
The People. Yes, this wonderful decade of optimism about ordinary people. The WPA murals and the movies of Frank Capra and this kind of thing.
The forgotten man.
Yes, Franklin Roosevelt's a great metaphor, which has been, by the way, Trump has tried to make his own. Have you seen this? Trump uses it all the time. I know. It's absolutely infuriating. But Roosevelt never called himself a populist. Nobody did in the 30s, because populism, the dictionary definition of it in the 30s was this movement in the 1890s that had died out. And but there are a lot of historians writing at the time said, obviously the legacy of Bryan and of the populists is very strong with Roosevelt, and Roosevelt would quote Bryan all the time, and he did all the things a populist wanted. He took us off the gold standard. He instituted that farm program that we talked about. He broke up the monopolies. He regulated the banks. He regulated Wall Street. It was a populist dream come true in the 1930s. And again, the elites of America, and again, they were unified group of elites, came together in opposition to Roosevelt in a really shocking way. And by the way, again, this was not a well-researched area. Most of the things I'm describing about populism in the New Deal are well known. If you read a good history of the period. But the opposition to Roosevelt is something I knew it had happened, but I didn't know the texture of it. And so I went and did the research. era of, and by the way, Phil, I talk too much. I know that. And if you want me to shut up, you just, I've almost killed the whole hour. And I am so sorry.
This is such a rich book. I mean, the audience at home, like, you all don't even realize we're like 2 chapters into the book now. We haven't even talked about Bayard Rustin and his
Yes, my hero.
borrowing of the populist economic program.
Yeah.
That the Poor People's March was modeled on the Bonus Army, which was modeled on Coxey's Army, which was a populist thing.
Yes.
But I do think I'm supposed to check in with John at this point and see if there are
the mysterious floating typewriter. There he is.
There are a few questions I think we can get to, and then maybe if we have time, Phil, we can toss it back to you for one more to sort of wrap things up. So the first question, going back to something you were talking about very early on, what was the shakedown among the farmers who were populist as far as outright owning land versus being a tenant farmer?
Good question. I actually don't know the exact numbers on that. I don't even know if it is knowable. This is the Marxist critique of populism. So populism is not Marxism. They knew who Marx was, and you'd even find in their newspapers, you'd find them quoting Marx all the time, and they would sell pamphlets of Marx's work. But they drew their they saw themselves as the sort of legatees of Thomas Jefferson, not Marx. And Marxists have traditionally sort of poo-pooed farmers' movements, at least in this country, because the farmers own, by and large, these are family farmers, and for the most part, they own their own land, especially in a place like Kansas. They almost certainly own it. That doesn't mean they're wealthy. Remember, this is the Homestead Act. They got the land for free, but but a lot of them in the South were tenant farmers, especially the Black Populists tended to be tenant farmers. A lot of the white populists too. Tenant farmers are in fact sort of the through line in all of the different sort of revivals of populism over the years. In the 30s, you think of those, all of those sort of New Deal efforts to document, people's lives, the lives of tenant farmers. I can't detect my microphone. What have I done? Can you hear me?
You dropped out for a second, but you're good now.
Okay. What was the book called? Oh, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. And you think of all the photos by, whatever, a New Deal photographer. They would send them down, and James A.G. Oh, he's the author. Well, come on, Walker. No, that's right, Walker Evans. God, I've got the book right here. I was going to reach for it, but no, I'm not going to do that. Anyhow, and then again in the 1960s, when you have a movement that I think was either proto-populist or the straight-on populism, which is SNCC, SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which would go to these communities in the South and organize Black voters. Well, they weren't allowed to vote at the time, but their whole idea, they had this very populist understanding of leadership, that the leader would organize the people and then get out of the way. It was all about the people themselves. Very admirable attitude that we have inherited from populism. But the way I would put it, John, is populism is our sort of American form, our American radical tradition. A lot of these guys did become socialists later on, but in truth, they never really sort of fully embraced the kind of Marxist interpretation of anything. These were total Jeffersonians or followers of Thomas Paine, or however you want to put it. And in some ways that is a tradition that's had, well, in a lot of ways, in almost every way, a tradition that's enjoyed great success in American life, whereas Marxism has always been sort of an intellectual thing.
There's a question from the audience. What were relations like between the populists and the large non-English speaking immigrant populations of the time?
So this is something that has been researched a lot. And the reason it's been researched, and by the way, we haven't got to this part of the story yet, Phil, so I'm going to jump ahead here. In the 1950s, there's a famous book comes out about populism. And this is where the definition of the word is turned inside out. Okay, the book is written by a famous historian at Columbia University called Richard Hofstadter, most famous historian of his day. And it's a really cruel attack on the populist movement. It's called The Age of Reform. And he accuses this is where the stereotype comes from. He says populists are anti-intellectual. They're people on their way down in life, and therefore they have status anxiety, which, by the way, a logic by which you could dismiss any movement of the left, except for like the sort of upper class, Silicon Valley left or something like that. But they're people on their way down. Therefore, you shouldn't take their views seriously. They're racist. They're xenophobic, and they're anti-Semitic. And they're also paranoid. They also have all these mental disorders. And immediately, other historians set about refuting Hofstadter's sort of vision of populism. He basically sees them as proto-fascist. And immediately, all these other historians go to work on this, and they refute Hofstadter's vision of populism in a really crushing manner. And one of the most famous refutations of Hofstadter, I've got it right here. You're not supposed to notice that I'm not wearing pants. This is it, the Tolerant Populists. And it's a study of populism in Kansas, my home state again, that goes the sort of county by county level, looking at who the populists were. And what the author finds is that, like, wow, they were overwhelmingly immigrants. So like immigrants from Ireland, immigrants from Scandinavia, immigrants from Germany, immigrants from Canada. In fact, there was an anti-immigrant group at the time. I mean, this is a very controversial. Immigration was very controversial in the 1890s. And there was an anti-immigration hate group at the time. They were called the APA, American Protective Association. And what this author found, which Hofstadter never mentions, is that the Kansas Populist Party would routinely denounce this hate group all the time, right? They're constantly making fun of these guys and attacking these guys. And in my own research, I came across the most incredible political cartoon. I'm going to describe it for you, but I reproduced it in the book, and you can also see it on my website on tcfrank.com. And it's one of these sort of political humor magazines of the 1890s that loved to attack Bryan and loved to attack populism. And it was also a very racist magazine and extremely anti-immigrant and anti-Semitic. I mean, in an overwhelming, like a loathsome kind of way. It's not even fun to do the research in it because the cartoons are so vicious. Anyhow, they had a cartoon of Bryan where they depict him as an Italian immigrant who has just assassinated Lady Liberty, and she lies bleeding on the pavement in front of the U.S. Treasury. And Hofstadter never mentions stuff like this. He knows about it because he's a great historian, but he never mentions, this really obvious evidence pointing the other direction. Anyhow,
it's a proto Ben Garrison.
I don't know who that is. Am I missing something?
You're missing. If you Google Ben Garrison, he's a pro-Trump editorial cartoinist who's
that guy. Oh my God.
Trump is like ripped all the time.
Breaks your brain.
Yes, I've seen those. Oh my God.
Well, it also just sounds like
that guy's kind of a crank, right? He's kind of a crank. These cartoonists that I'm describing were the mainstream of the day. Right. And by the way, so I described Hofstadter's attack on populism, and it's almost completely lifted from the attack on Bryan from 1896, that the newspapers and magazines of 1896 that they attacked William Jennings Bryan with, except for one part. Nobody thought of attacking populism by calling it racist or calling it anti-immigrant or or anti-Semitic in the 1890s. Why?
Because
they themselves, yes, because they themselves were so incredibly racist and anti-Semitic, and that would have just been bizarre. You're flipping through the pages of this magazine, and it's just cruelly, viciously anti-Semitic. They would. To accuse populists of that would have been really strange. Anyhow, that's can I skip ahead a little bit? Hofstadter's thesis was utterly refuted. This is fascinating. Utterly refuted by the American history profession, but it won the day anyways. It doesn't matter. And so today, when people use the word populism in the way that they do, that's where they're getting it from. It's derived explicitly and directly from Richard Hofstadter, from one of these books that's like that one of the most refuted works of American history that there is. And so I started wondering, how did this happen? I studied history a long time ago. This was a famous controversy. Hofstadter wrote this book. The book was refuted massively and overwhelmingly. Everybody that studies American history knows this. How is it that Hofstadter's interpretation is still going all these years later? So I'm asking myself that question, and I came up with an answer. And it's just this: it's that Hofstadter, when he was writing, he was part of this group they called the Consensus Scholars, and their great idea was that that American history, there was no real dissent in American life. We all agreed on pretty much everything, and people who disagreed, there was something wrong with them. And their other idea was that basically they were at a time when the sort of managerial class, the sort of professional white collar managerial class, was coming into its own. This was the great heyday of the man in the gray flannel suit, the organization man. The MBAs were taking over the corporations. People with PhDs were running the Pentagon, and all the great departments in Washington. And the university system was growing by leaps and bounds. And these guys were so completely rational. They understood everything with the modern tools of psychology. You didn't want or need mass movements of working class people anymore. They were fundamentally irrational, and they're something you had to avoid because they were pathological, they were racist, they were, you couldn't trust them. So populism for Hofstadter is the great symbol of everything that's wrong with mass movements of working class people. What you do want, the way you really get reform and manage the Cold War and manage the economy and do all the rest of it, is by bringing in people like Hofstadter and his friends, consensus scholars, the managerial elite, and they'll run things for you and they'll do a good job, and they'll sit together around the great mahogany conference table in Washington, and they will come to consensus with one another. And this is a dream that continues. And whenever someone badmouths populism, they are sort of implicitly talking about this dream, this sort of managerial dream. That's their vision. By the way, and that's the vision today of the Democratic Party. I mean, you talk about a party that has gone from being a populist, its roots are in populism. It is the party of Roosevelt, the party of Bryan, et cetera, has become the party of technocracy, of the managerial elite, of the sort of white collar. I'm here in Bethesda, Maryland, this very white collar, affluent place. I haven't seen a Trump sign yet in this go round. Oh my God, I talk so much. I've got to stop. I've got to stop.
Great. We've got one more question. And I think we've got time for it. It's fine if we go a bit over. And the viewer asks, forgive me if it's answered later in the book. But do you know if the choosing of the Populist Party named by the conservative White Nationalist Party, which ran David Duke on its 88 presidential ticket, was a deliberate attempt to co-opt the term populist for the right? Was it a coincidence, or had the co-option already taken place a bit earlier?
So I did not know that. I knew that there was a right-wing effort that called itself populist. It's pretty unusual for people to call themselves populists, but that would be what you'd see there would be somebody trying to. It's sort of the same thing that Steve Bannon is doing all the time. They're trying to come up with a name for what they're doing that they know the name has some nobility attached to it. They're not sure why. It's funny, these guys don't ever read, they don't read books, so they don't really know. Jimmy Carter was the last president to call himself a populist. Actually, that's not true. Obama referred to himself as a populist more than once, but in a kind of backhanded way. There were all of these efforts in the 60s and 70s to start up a new populism, and people would use the word, they meant, populism in my sense, a true populism, meaning a mass movement of working class people for economic democracy. And the last real leader of that was this guy, Fred Harris. Do you see this? He ran for president as a Democrat in 1976 and sort of proto Bernie Sanders. He's still around, by the way. I interviewed him for the book. Great man.
He said he slept on supporters' couches as he went across the United States. He was like a punk rock band.
He campaigned in a Winnebago.
This guy rules.
Yeah, and he was the first one to to do this campaign based entirely on small donations. Like his supporters would have garage sales and bake sales and stuff like that. And it was the proto Bernie Sanders. It's where, but he didn't have the internet to do fundraising with. But he's still around. He's the last surviving member of all things. He's the last surviving member of the Kerner Commission on the urban riots in the 1960s. Truly one of the great figures in American politics. But and he actually wrote more than one book about the new populism, as he called it. So it is funny that even with that going on, you have these right-wing figures embracing the term. Presidents rarely do it, but advisors to Ronald Reagan's chief strategist, I'm blanking on the guy's name right now, often called Reagan a populist. Of course, Lee Atwater referred to George Bush Sr. as
the patrician head of the CIA.
I know. Referred to him as a populist
who ever lived.
Exactly. And of course, Steve Bannon and Pat Buchanan likes to refer to himself as a populist. If you go to Buchanan is kind of the evil genius behind all of this. He's the one, he's the one that got Nixon to use the phrase the silent majority. Mm-hmm. He was Reagan's PR guy, and of course, then he ran for president himself, and his own campaign slogan was "America First." And so Trump just stole it, mm-hmm. and then stole Buchanan's entire rate. Remember Buchanan in what was it, 96? He became famous for being the Republican or was it 92? He went after the trade agreements. Mm-hmm. And this was the first time anybody did this. And he did it from the right, which was shocking because Reagan and Bush had negotiated those, NAFTA, right? And here's Buchanan denouncing these things. And then Trump just took everything straight from Buchanan. It's a funny world, folks.
We have a viewer who's actually a colleague of mine at the bookstore who writes in that she met Fred Harris and that's what he did. He slept on the state rep in Ann Arbor's couch.
That's awesome.
So
yeah,
there's firsthand history here. Well, I just want to give Thomas and Phil, any parting thoughts about populism and perhaps about the brutal week ahead.
I have a practical question I want to ask because, practical political concerns are very much on my mind right now for obvious reasons. What strategic things do we need to learn from the populists that we've forgotten? Like people on the left, what are the strategic moves they made that we need to make, that we need to bring back?
I think, rather than talk about the sort of, they were in a 3-party world, which doesn't exist anymore. And so all of their strategies were sort of based on trying to align with one party, team up with one party against the other, or, things like this. But they realized something, and they were the first ones in American life to realize this. And we've forgotten it today, and we've forgotten it at our great cost. And that is, so they were coming out of a system when the two parties were defined by which side you were on in the Civil War, by your religion. So Protestants were Republicans, Catholics were Democrats, by your ethnicity. I forget how they lined up, but like Irish would generally be Democrats, WASPs would generally be Republican, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the populists said, no, your political affiliation should be based on your class interest. And this was radical. This was revolutionary. And that lesson, of course, was eventually learned by the Democratic Party in the 1930s, when the Democratic Party fully became sort of the party of labor, the party of working people. And that led to decades of Democratic triumph, of Democrats as the dominant party in the system, overwhelmingly dominant party in the system, from the year 1930 up to the year 1994, when they finally lost their majority in Congress. And that is something, and the Democrats have been on a different fantasy in recent years of being the party of, the affluent suburbs and the party of Trump, Biden just said this the other day, where the innovation, university-based innovation, whatever it is, it's this sort of creative class bullshit, basically. And that is a recipe for disaster, as we have learned in recent years. And Biden probably, everybody's saying he's going to win in a couple of days here. We don't know, but the Republicans are going to continue in this bizarre upside down pseudo populist outreach that they've been doing, trying to remake themselves into the workers' party. And the reason they do it is because the Democrats have abandoned the high ground of politics, in my opinion. And that's the lesson that oh my God, do we need to remember?
Yeah, amen.
Well, we've reached the top of the hour. Thomas Frank, Phil Christman, I want to thank you both so much for joining us this evening at Home with Literati and being here.
I just want to say this was a blast, and I can't wait till when the paperback comes out and this is over. I'm going to come there to Ann Arbor in person, and we're going to do this again, and everybody's going to be invited, and we're going to have a great old time.
Hell yeah! This was an honor for me. I've loved your work for years, and I'm totally sincere about telling everybody, buy this book and read it. Great.
Thank you, Phil. That is really nice of you.
Well, I think we should maybe play us out again with some Academy Fight song. To everyone watching at home, thanks for tuning in. Once again, thank you, Thomas Frank, Phil Christman. We hope you continue to be safe and stay well, and we'll see you at the bookstore for the paperback tour. Take care, everybody.